Well, good morning, and welcome to Learning Tree's webinar on Blazor, the when, the why, and the how. Um, my name is Peter Vogel. I'm also the person who put this webinar together. And as you can tell, it's my very first webinar for Learning Tree, so it's going to be an experience for all of us. Um, we're broadcasting on VoIP audio only, so any questions you have, as I just embarrassed myself by pointing out, put those in the chat pod, and I'll keep my eye on the chat pod, and maybe we'll be able to work the answers in. If not, we'll certainly take them up at the end. We've got 10 or 15 minutes left aside at the end to do nothing but talk to, or chat with each other, I guess I should say. A little background about myself. I've been an independent consultant for over 20 years now. Before that, I was the head of an IT department for a large multinational heavy equipment manufacturer. And I quit because I didn't want to manage people who created applications. I wanted to create applications. And the company immediately turned around and hired me back to continue to run the department as my first contracting gig. There you go. Since I've been an independent consultant, my clients have included the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, Service Brands International. You probably haven't heard of them, but they run Molly Maid and Mr. Handyman, a bunch of other franchises. I've done work for Microsoft. If you're interested, I helped one of my clients, Stemco, build a commercial product called BATRF, B-A-T-R-F, for the trucking industry. You can look that up. Pretty much since I became a consultant, I've been involved with Learning Tree. I'm not an employee. I'm an independent contractor, but they hire me in to write courses for them and do webinars, apparently, and to teach for them. In fact, I've written 8 or 9 courses for them over the 20-plus years I've been involved. So what I want to talk about, I don't want to get into the details of implementing Blazor. That's not the purpose of this. We've got a 2-day course on that, which I wrote. So I'm going to plug that course all week, well, all day. You can count on it. But I do want to talk about when does Blazor make sense and why is it a technology that you should be looking at. And then right at the end of this session, I want to convince you that Blazor is actually key to the future of computing. I know that sounds sort of like a grand claim, but I'll try to convince you of it anyway. But that's right at the end. So before I get into this, I'd like to do a quick demo of Blazor. And by the way, this is going to be the most boring demo in the world. So I am starting up a web page here. And you can see up here that circling dots. That means that this web page was talking to the web server. So it was going back and forth to the web server. It was pulling this page down. But I want you to simultaneously look at what I'm doing up here and look up here at this tab. And you'll notice we never see that circle again because we never go back to the web server again. So I'm going to first update the delivery date to today's date. So I'm going to click on this button. You can see that updated to today's date. I'm going to update the quantity on hand for this particular product. We have in the Central Canada warehouse, we have 599 of it, not 5. And notice up here, we're going to update the total quantity on hand when I click this button. So there's, we have 698 in stock. And I can now go and still notice, never going back to the server, I will now go to a completely different screen. And this will allow me to do something like, for instance, say this warehouse isn't in Regina, where I was born, but is in fact in Winnipeg, where I grew up. And I'm going to click Update Warehouse. I won't drag you through the Add New button. And we'll go back here. And if I click on Central Canada again, we can see that, yes, I've succeeded in updating that. Now, why is that interesting? I mean, this is just an Ajax application. We see these all the time. Because this is the code I've been running. This is C# code. This is not JavaScript. And all the previous applications that you've seen that have done this kind of thing have been using JavaScript. Oh, what a shame. Well, trust me, it was a heck of a demo. Can you see my slides? Like the content slide right now. Is that visible to you? Yes. Oh, okay. Well, trust me, the demo was great. What we saw in that demo was we saw a standard Ajax application, but that standard Ajax application was running using C# code. And not only just using C# code, but interacting with what we call the .NET framework, the server-side components that make up Microsoft's toolkit for building applications. So let's talk then about why this is, how this magic is possible. First off, recognize that the application that you didn't get to see is, in fact, typical these days. I remember the first time I ordered something over the internet. It was from Tower Records, which gives you some idea of how long ago that was. And I filled out this whole long form, and I clicked the submit button, and I got back the whole form again, everything blanked out with a note that I had my date in the wrong format. That's not the way we do things anymore. Now what we expect as we type stuff in, we expect our web pages to respond immediately. We do not expect to have to click the submit button. If I pick a customer from a drop-down list, I expect that customer information to be displayed. Right now, to build that kind of application, most developers end up using two tool sets. We have one set of tools for everything that we build on our web servers. For me, I use the Microsoft.NET framework and C# as my programming language. Then we have another tool set for all that interactive stuff that happens in the browser. And all of that stuff is done with JavaScript and huge development systems written in JavaScript. Up until Blazor, the only language you could use reliably in a browser was JavaScript. So this isn't great. As the ex-head of an IT department, I like to keep my toolkit small. Because if I keep my toolkit small, it's easier to manage, but more importantly, my developers get better and better and better at using that toolkit. And furthermore, my developers can move from one application to another application because it's the same toolkit that's being used for all of them. And if you're getting the impression that I really don't care if that toolkit is C# or COBOL, you're probably not far wrong, quite frankly. So what's the solution to this two toolkit problem? One solution is JavaScript everywhere. And that is to use JavaScript also for our server-side stuff, not just for the stuff that happens in the browser, but also for building our applications on the server. And there are problems with this. This is not the kind of development that JavaScript was designed for. And in fact, over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been sort of an evolution of JavaScript and replacements for JavaScript. And I say replacements, they're not really, what they are is they're languages that compile into JavaScript, because again, the only thing that works reliably on your browser is JavaScript. So we have tools that will compile other languages into JavaScript, varying degrees of success. So fundamentally, what we're talking about here is this idea of JavaScript everywhere. And why do I say that JavaScript really isn't designed for this kind of thing? Well, one, you give up data typing. JavaScript doesn't distinguish between different kinds of numbers, like currencies with 2 decimals, and integers that have no decimals at all. It doesn't really distinguish between anything except text and numbers. It means that we can't have a lot of design time support, that a lot of JavaScript programs, you don't find the bug, you don't find the problem until you run the code, because of the way JavaScript is built, and it's a tremendously flexible language. I love JavaScript because of its flexibility, but it means that there are all sorts of things I cannot check. I cannot have my development tools check for me until I run it. Plus, JavaScript isn't really built the way we do modern application development. Modern application development is all built around this idea of object-oriented programming. JavaScript was built around a completely different kind of model, something called prototype-based programming. And for the last, again, 4 or 5 years, people have been trying, JavaScript has been evolving, to shoehorn more object-oriented programming into it. I'm not sure that's great for JavaScript, quite frankly. I mean, the reason I love JavaScript is because it was this different, or is still this different programming model. So here's Microsoft's solution. Microsoft's solution is, why don't we just use the server-side tools everywhere? Why don't we, in the browser, use C# and .NET. There's still a place for JavaScript. There are some things that right now with the current state of Blazor that you need to do with JavaScript. But typically it's 1 or 2 lines of JavaScript code at the most. And quite frankly, even then, there's a whole set of add-ons and plugins and libraries coming out for Blazor that allows you to, well, basically not use JavaScript. You can just write everything in Blazor. The result of this is that the browser is just another platform. I mean, Microsoft's new development system is called .NET Core. And one of the things that's cool about .NET Core is it runs on everything. I'm building .NET Core applications that run on Linux and delivering them on Linux, by the way. I'm building .NET Core applications that run, thanks to a package called Xamarin from Microsoft, that run on Android smartphones, run on iOS, Apple smartphones. I believe my applications will run on Macintoshes. I myself have never done it, but I'm certainly being told that it does. So as a result, the browser is just another platform that I can write my C# code for and deploy my application to the browser. I should mention, by the way, that, as I said, JavaScript still has an ever decreasing role to play, even in a Blazor-enabled application. I should also mention that Blazor interoperates with JavaScript very well and very easily. I can, from my Blazor code, call a JavaScript routine, pass it information, get information back. I can, from JavaScript, I can call my Blazor routines, my Blazor methods, and pass them data, information, and get data and information back. So in those increasingly rare conditions where I need JavaScript, just not a problem. So how is this possible? Because if you heard about things like this in the past from Microsoft, it's often sort of a Microsoft hack, Silverlight, and it has a certain lifespan, and then for various reasons it goes away. That's not the case with Blazor. Blazor is actually based on a World Wide Web Consortium standard. World Wide Web Consortium is the organization that sets the standards for web applications. And one of the things that they developed most recently was HTML5, which is a new specification for how browsers are supposed to deal with web pages. What's part of that specification is something called WebAssembly, and it's being implemented in all the browsers. When I talk about running Blazor, I'm talking about running Blazor on Firefox, on Chrome, on Internet Edge. Again, I've never run it on Safari. I really should, just to make sure it really does work, because all of these browsers implement what's called WASM, this WebAssembly, which is apparently too many syllables, so we just call it WASM. What WASM does is specify a very low-level language and an environment to execute that very low-level language in. So all Microsoft, I say this all like it's trivial, I'm sure it was an enormous amount of work, but all Microsoft had to do was compile the .NET framework and compile C# code into this language that the browser supports. That's all they had to do. Remember, they're already doing this. They're already doing this for Android phones. They're already doing it for Apple phones. They're already doing it for Linux. And I'm told they're already doing it for Macintosh. So this was just another platform. So that's Blazor. Blazor is the .NET framework and a environment for executing the .NET framework and a compiler that converts your code into or your developer's code into WASM compatible code. And then on top of that, Microsoft built an environment for creating client-side applications. So if you've worked with any of the JavaScript client-side applications, if your organization is using Angular or React or any of these development environments, they all include a whole bunch of, let's call it infrastructure for want of a better word. So that's the ability to design forms, the ability to move from one page to another page, the ability to accept button clicks, to display data to the user, all that kind of stuff that we take for granted. Microsoft has built all of that into Blazor. It's not quite at the same level of sophistication that you would get with an older product like Angular, but it's probably going to be there by next year. I'm building and delivering Blazor applications for my client. I haven't missed anything yet. But all my Angular friends keep telling me, oh, don't worry, eventually you're going to want to do this obscure thing. And Blazor doesn't support it until next year. You know what? I'm okay with that. I'm building, delivering application. Not really a problem. Where can you build Blazor? If you have any of the Microsoft development tools, Visual Studio 2019, Visual Studio Code, which has the added benefit of being free, they all support Blazor. Really, any environment, any development environment that supports delivering .NET applications, .NET Core applications, is ready to deliver Blazor. It just is another platform. It also integrates with ASP.NET Core, obviously, but at least one version of Blazor, the only thing you need ASP.NET Core for is to deliver the application to the browser, to the client. Once you get that down to the client, once you get your Blazor application down to the client, it really doesn't matter what the rest of your application is written in. So, and I would not be surprised to find that Microsoft is looking for ways for you to deliver Blazor applications without having any part of your application set up as ASP.NET Core. I don't know that. I'm just making that up. But it seems like the next obvious step. All right. So let me take 5 to 10 minutes of your time and get really geeky here. I want to talk a little bit about how Blazor actually works. And as I suggested on the previous slide, there's actually two forms of Blazor. And I want to talk about what those two forms of Blazor are, because this does make a difference. A Blazor app consists of what are called components. Had you seen that demo I did, you would have seen that my page was divided into two parts. The first part gave you information about a product, and the second part gave you information about all the warehouses where those parts are kept. And those were two separate components. That gives me the ability to create new pages by mixing and matching components. So I get a lot of reusability. If you were to look at an actual component, and what you see on the screen there in that box, that's an actual component. The top part defines the user interface. And as you can see, that's all just plain old HTML. And then down near the bottom, we have that yellow highlighted part that says @code. And from there on, it's plain ordinary C# and .NET Framework objects. So that's a component. By the way, I've used this, the latest version of Blazor came out on December 3rd, version 3.1, actually .NET Core 3.1, which included a new version of Blazor. That new version of Blazor, what you see here on the screen is very comfortable for developers who are using Angular or React or any of those JavaScript frameworks. And that is they have your user interface, your HTML, and your code in the same file. A lot of programmers, especially Windows programmers, aren't comfortable with that. The latest version of Blazor allows you to keep your user interface, your HTML, in one file and your code in another file. A lot of developers prefer that. You can go either way, whatever makes you comfortable. I think one of the reasons they went this route is to make it comfortable for Angular developers, and the reason they've added the ability to have separate files make it comfortable for server-side developers, C# developers. It is very extendable. I can create my own new objects, classes, add them to the framework, use them, and it is very object-oriented. It is Microsoft standard development tools. So that's a Blazor component. Now, as I said, there were two versions of delivering those Blazor components. One version is in production right now, came out in November, and that was server-side Blazor. Came out in November, new version in December. This is very new technology and rapidly evolving technology, obviously. Sorry, September, not November. And then version 3 came out in December of this year. What this does, server-side Blazor, which is in production right now, is it downloads a JavaScript file to the browser. Then as the user interacts with your components, that information is sent back to your Blazor app, which is actually running on your server. It's not actually running on the browser. The only part that runs on the server is this JavaScript the only thing that runs on the browser is this JavaScript proxy. Everything else is communicated back in real time to the Blazor application on the server. This makes it really easy for you to use your server-side resources. Again, in the demo, for instance, I updated a part of the database. I retrieved data from the database. Because my Blazor app is running on the server, I just talked to my database. It was trivially easy to do. However, there are problems with this. The problems with this are, as you might expect, all around this network connection. There is the potential for latency here, that you will do something here in the browser and eventually it will process on the server. There's also a possibility you'll lose the connection altogether here and Blazor will stop working. And the technology that's being used to handle this communication, it's another W3C standard called WebSockets, which is part of the HTML5 spec. Again, it's been around for several years now. Microsoft has built a toolkit for working with it. But again, it's all web standards that is handling this communication. The problem with WebSockets is that there's a limit to the number of simultaneous applications you can support with WebSockets on a single server. Now, that limitation is really high. Microsoft suggests it's something like 250,000 simultaneous users. I don't have a client whose application has 250,000 simultaneous users, so this is not something I worry about. But it could very easily be for you. If this strikes you as a concern, let me just mention, if you've ever gone to a website and opened a chat window, that chat window has been using WebSockets. Anytime you've had a chat experience, customer service, or buying something and you opened a chat window, you've been using WebSockets. If you found that to be reliable and responsive and scalable, this will be just as reliable, scalable, and responsive. So, all right. Well, if there are problems with server-side Blazor, what's the solution? The solution is client-side Blazor, which is currently an experimental technology. You can use it. And again, I've used client-side Blazor on Firefox, on Chrome, on Internet Edge, not on Safari. Client-side Blazor is in preview right now, and it's scheduled to go into production in May of 2020. And what's the difference? Well, with client-side Blazor, what happens is your Blazor application is in fact downloaded to the browser, which is really, I think, what we all want, is that application downloaded to the browser. It does mean, however, that when I want to access stuff on the server, I'm going to have to call a web service. I'm going to have to reach over to my web server and call a web service, and it will retrieve the data. I should point out this is exactly what every JavaScript and Ajax application does, that those JavaScript and Ajax applications are working with web services. The other thing that means is, by the way, you can write your web services, as I suggested earlier on, they can run on any platform, write them in any language you want. Once you start accessing web services, it really doesn't matter what platform you build your services in. So what language you build your services in. So it's very agnostic that way. So that means that, as I said, if you want to get involved with Blazor, really the only part that has to be ASP.NET Core compatible is the Blazor application. Other than that, if you've got web services written in PHP, knock yourself out. Blazor don't care. All right, if this is so great, why is it still in preview? Why isn't it in full production mode? It's the size of the download. Downloading a Blazor app right now involves downloading, I don't want to say the whole .NET framework, but a whole big hunk of it, and then compiling it on the client. Right now, that's about 2 megabytes. And you go, what does that mean? Well, if you were building an application using Angular or React, which are two of the more popular JavaScript frameworks, they're about a quarter of the size. Their download is about a quarter the size. Now this just affects startup time, right? So, but it does mean that if you were to start up a Blazor application, you would hit the website and now your application is running. And it much will be affected by how fast your internet connection is. If you were using one of the JavaScript development tools, it would start up in about a quarter of the time. The solution to this is something called ahead of time compile. And that's what's delaying, that's what's pushing off the delivery of a production version of client-side Blazor. That's what's supposed to be ready in May of 2020. Now, having said that, I have no doubt that roughly May or June of next year, client-side Blazor will be ready. But Microsoft has also got a new version of .NET that's scheduled to come out in November of next year. And my guess is there's going to be some additional performance enhancements, structural performance enhancements to Blazor in that. But right now, if you're going, well, this sounds interesting, but really what I want is client-side Blazor, May of next year. And you'll have a down. And by the way, I should point out that Microsoft's initial tests suggest that client-side Blazor download, once they get it working, is going to be half the size of the Angular or React. So not only will you get to use one tool set on both platforms, you should, notice use the keyword should, also have a faster download than if you're using one of the JavaScript development tools. So just saying. Which raises the question, well, maybe I want to get involved with server-side Blazor right now, and then we'll migrate to client-side Blazor when the time comes. What's the difference? There really isn't any. If you're looking at a component, if you're looking at code, you cannot tell the difference between client-side Blazor and server-side Blazor. This code you see here on the page, it would run exactly the same, both in client-side and server-side Blazor. The only thing that's different is when you want to access data. If you go with server-side Blazor, you just reach over, grab the data. If you're going with client-side Blazor, you've got to call web service. So if you want to get involved with server-side Blazor now, and I think, by the way, there are some obvious places where it makes sense to use server-side Blazor right now, with the idea that you might eventually migrate to client-side Blazor, all you really have to do is make sure that you isolate your data access into separate methods or classes so that when it comes time to move it to the client, you can replace that direct access code with a call to a web service, and you'd be off to the races. So that is, those two bullets are the only difference that matters between client and server-side Blazor. Not hard to manage. Okay, as I said, this is the geeky portion. How does Blazor interact with your user interface, or your HTML? Because you don't want to get involved with this if it requires you creating peculiar HTML. The way Blazor interacts right now is exactly the way you would do it if you're using one of the JavaScript frameworks. And that is you insert into your HTML code these areas that are, you can see they're highlighted in yellow. Right at the top where you see customer ID, this is how I display the ID property of a .NET customer object. This is how I control the disabled property attribute on my HTML with a variable, a C# variable called disable. This is how I ensure that if the user types something, this is a text box here, if the user types something into the text box, it will update the birth date on the customer object. And if in my code I update the birth date in the customer object, it will automatically be displayed in the text box. I can also tie, and I haven't put an example on here, but I can also tie events on my text box. So when the user changes stuff in the text box, it will automatically run some C# code for me. So all I have to do is, as I say, I don't use a peculiar form of HTML. It's just where I would normally put in data, I put in these @ and the name of a C# variable, and I'm done. There are some limitations. I was about to say I have to be honest, but I'd worry if I had to warn you that I was being honest. Interaction, one of the things that came with the most recent browsers are a whole bunch of what are called APIs, most of which turn into those annoying dialog boxes that pop up when they go to your site. Do you want to block notifications? Do you want to allow them to know allow the site to know where you are? All of those various APIs, geolocation, managing multimedia, all of that stuff was designed to be called from JavaScript, not from WASM code. Um, how can you get around that? You can integrate JavaScript to call them, and that will take care of it. The other thing you do, there's more and more libraries. If I want to do geolocation with C# code, I can now. There's a library. I call its methods. It talks to the browser on my behalf, and I never have to touch JavaScript. The other thing, and again, this is true of all the JavaScript libraries, if I'm writing pure JavaScript, I can completely redesign the page. I can delete components from the page, and I can insert components in the page. Yeah, Blazor isn't set up to work that way. Instead, it works with this idea of adding and removing components, and very much like you would expect from a standard desktop application. And again, this is the way all the JavaScript development frameworks tend to work, is that they don't have you completely redraw the user interface, but they have you work with components. But again, if you want to do that, you certainly can. In this case, you would have to call out to a JavaScript routine that would handle that for you. So the story I'm trying to tell you here is that Blazor gives you everything that the application development frameworks that most organizations use to build client-side applications in JavaScript. And those are things like Angular and Knockout and React and all those. Blazor does all of that. It has exactly the same limitations and exactly the same benefits. Does exactly the same things, except one toolkit, both for the server and for the client. An object-oriented toolkit with lots and lots of compile time, design time checking to ensure that you find your problems before you run your code. The last thing that I would be worried about if someone was talking to me about this is I'd go, well, how difficult is it for me to add a component to a page? How do I add Blazor to a page? Well, let me show you what that code looks like. You can do it either this way, so you add this hunk of code, or you can do it this way. The benefit of doing it, if you're looking closely, if you're wondering, I don't see a difference here. The only difference is this option I've specified here. And this option does a better job of allowing the page to support Google searches, and this option does not. So if you want your Blazor component to be accessible to Google searches, you would use this option. If that's not important to you, you would use this option. And this part right here allows me to pass data from my server-side application to my Blazor application. One of the things that drives me nuts is when I download a JavaScript Ajax application, and it downloads and the page is blank, and then I get whirring circles while it's fetching all the data. What this allows me to do is build the initial page on the server and then deliver it down to the user. And now, as soon as the page appears, it's ready to be used. We don't have to go back. We certainly can if we want to. We don't have to go back to the server to get data. And that's what this option down here allows you to do. And then you need this JavaScript tag here. That's it. So either one of these two div elements and this script tag. Oh, by the way, if you're working with .NET, with the latest version of .NET Core, there's a tag, there's an element you can use in here instead of using this ugly code. There's a HTML style element you can use instead. So, last thing, what if you lose connection to the server? If in fact, if you're working with server-side Blazor, and remember this isn't a problem with client-side Blazor, server-side Blazor, if you lose connection to the server, Blazor just takes care of it. It will attempt to reconnect, and if it can't reconnect, guess what it'll do? It'll just pop up this little message and give the user a link to start over. If you would like to do more than that, you certainly can. You would basically add a bunch of div elements to your page like this and tie them to these cascading style sheet classes that are delivered by Blazor. And Blazor will automatically, when it loses the connection, tries to reconnect. If it can't reconnect, it will automatically make these div elements available to the user, automatically make them visible. So you can warn the user when you're attempting to reconnect, or Blazor is attempting to reconnect, and you can give the user a customized experience for reconnecting to your server. So you can take the default, I think certainly the easiest, or if you wish, you can completely customize the user interface when the connection is lost. I've tested this. It's really hard to test this because it's very, very difficult to break the connection to the server. It's an uphill battle to test this code because the connections do seem to be very reliable. I can't get away without talking about security. As with any client-side environment, you cannot authenticate the user in the browser. The browser simply is far too easy to hack. So, but there's nothing stopping you, like any other web application, from gathering the user's credentials in the server and sending them back in the browser, gather credentials in the browser and sending them back to the server for authentication. What's cool about Blazor, especially if you're working in .NET Core, is all of the authorization information, the user's roles, the user's names, any security claims the user's made, all of those are available to your Blazor application. So implementing security, authorizing the user to access components, pages, individual buttons, you have all the information on Blazor that you have in your server-side application. In fact, if you want to do it through code, it's exactly the same code. There's that one tool set again. It's exactly the same code that you would use in a server-side environment. Plus, Blazor gives you the ability to secure your application using what I think of as declarative security, where you just say, only these people are allowed to use this component. Only these users are allowed to access this button. And you do that just by putting in HTML tags. You do not have to write code. The reason I like that is if I write code, I could put a bug in it. If all I'm doing is saying only these users and list off the roles, or only these users and list off the roles, I'll probably get that right. But if I write code, now I've got to debug it. All right. So I hope I tried to think of all the things I was concerned about when I heard about Blazor, which is interoperability, support for my development tools, network issues, where the technology was going, security, reliability. I hope I've addressed all the issues you'd have. Before I leave, I want to convince you that Blazor is in fact the future of programming, at least in the Microsoft environment. You are free to disagree with me. Let me go back and talk about that tool that I use to create smartphone applications. It's called Xamarin. It's from Microsoft. And what I do is I write some code and I design my user interface. And then I compile it. And when I go to build my application, I can say, oh yeah, build the Android version, build the Apple version, build the Windows Phone version. Hey, you never know. Maybe it'll make a comeback. I suspect there's going to be a time when Windows phones are back in style because they're retro. Anyway, the reason that works is because of something called Mono. Mono is a runtime environment for .NET that's designed to run on any platform. And that's what goes to the smartphones. That's what goes to my Android phone, to my iOS phone. If this sounds like Blazor, it should. This was what enabled Blazor, this idea of a .NET environment that you could host, you could put anywhere you want. Now, the reason that this is attractive is because when I'm running on Android, I don't look like a .NET application running on Android. My Android application uses all the same user interface elements as any other Android application. And I have access to all the Android-specific functionality. Ditto with my Apple phone. I have access to my Apple phone app. I have access to all the Apple phone applications, and I'm using native Apple user interface widgets. I look like a standard Apple application, even though I've built it with the one tool set I really understand and with a single tool set for my web services that my smartphones access, for my Android phone, for my iOS phone, and now with Blazor. So here is Microsoft's plan. Blazor is not deeply attached to HTML as its user interface. And as you can see, the technology it's built on is already working in several other user interface environments. So Microsoft's goal is by May of next year to deliver client-side Blazor. About that time or shortly thereafter, Blazor is going to come installed with Windows. So one day you're going to get a Windows update and there's going to be Blazor. That version of Blazor will be set up to work with a Windows native user interface called Electron. So you can write Blazor applications that will create create Electron applications running on Windows. They'll look a little bit different. They'll have a special kind of window and won't be fully integrated. By the end of next year, when .NET 5 comes out in November, Blazor will be seamlessly integrating with Windows. This means that if I write code, that code can run in the browser, on an Android phone, on Windows, on an Apple phone. By the end of next year, Blazor will be working with any user interface. So you can run your Blazor applications anywhere you want to. Yes, you will have a lot of platform-specific technology. You'll put that in your web services, just like you do with your smartphones. Right now, when you run an application on Android phone or an iOS phone, they're calling out to web services. Blazor from your browser is calling out for web services. There have been a number of attempts to create a single development environment that would deliver to all of these platforms. They've all failed to deliver to the browser platform. The reason they've all failed to deliver to the browser platform is because JavaScript is just a different beast from every other development language. It's not object-oriented. It's not data. It's just different. And as a result, all of these previous attempts have failed because it was impossible to compile some other language. It was impossible to convert some other language to JavaScript. Blazor takes that problem off the table. It's gone. So you don't have to, you can use the same language everywhere now. So I think this is a very big deal. So further resources, if you want to continue to investigate. Why should you use Blazor? To simplify your web development toolkit, to make your developers more productive by giving them a better development tool than JavaScript, and to give you more flexibility in using your developer resources. When does it make sense? For client-side programming, and because only server-side Blazor is in production. I mean, you can use client-side Blazor right now if you're willing to wait for the download. Intranet applications, and this is what I'm building for my clients, is intranet applications using Blazor. Next year in May, when client-side Blazor comes out, everywhere. How can you start using it? Well, you have to adopt ASP.NET Core version 3.0, and then it's just a matter of starting to type. Oh, and did I mention I wrote a course about Blazor that I think everyone should take? Silly eye. Take course 2326. Though we actually, with Learning Tree, have a number of resources. There's web application development. That's that course I keep talking about. ASP.NET Core for ASP.NET MVC developers. That's how you that's the course to take if you're migrating. If you're currently using ASP.NET, then you want to migrate to ASP.NET Core. That's what that course is targeted to do. It's 3 days. And it's got a section in there on Blazor, as a matter of fact. Topics that you should be following up on, ASP.NET Core and JavaScript. Remember, Microsoft's target for Blazor is everything you can do with a JavaScript development environment, you can do with Blazor. And here's some links that will allow you to see related courses at Learning Tree and upcoming webinars. Well, I promised 10 to 15 minutes for people to ask questions, and it is 9:44, so I guess we have to sit quietly for a minute before anyone could ask any questions. Just kidding. What would you like to ask about Blazor? Let's see if I can answer those questions for you. This is the point where I discovered that everybody got bored and wandered off. Quarter of an hour ago, half an hour ago. So if you just type in the chat window, we can deal with any of your questions. You guys just like watching me sit up here and twist in the wind, don't you? This is fun. Oh, does Blazor scale well? I think that's a really good question. Based on my experience with my clients, yes, it scales very well. Ultimately, I mean, the key thing here with client-side Blazor, a Blazor application is running on the user's computer. And I always think, I mean, that's a true distributed application, isn't it? You're distributing your code over multiple computers. Um, I always think you should regard the user's computer as a free, unlimited resource that you should exploit mercilessly. But of course, as I said, client-side Blazor is only in preview. Works fine, by the way. Just got that download issue. Server-side Blazor, in my experience, building intranet applications does in fact scale very, very well. We've got one application with hundreds of users on it, and it's just fine. Thank you very much. The limitations in scaling there are twofold. One, you are running Blazor on the server, so you know how many simultaneous applications can you run on your server. If you are using a server farm to improve scalability, that works for Blazor. Also, you can distribute your Blazor applications over all the servers on your server farm. The other limitation is special to Blazor, and that's how many WebSocket connections can you maintain. And again, if you're working in a server farm, distributing those WebSocket connections over multiple servers addresses that problem also. And as I said, Microsoft, I have not tried this myself, but Microsoft has said they've had up to 250,000 simultaneous WebSocket connections successfully run. Now, I should point out that was on a virtual machine running on Azure, so your mileage may vary. But I have to admit, I've yet, and I've used SignalR in other applications, and I have yet to bump up against the scalability limit. It does seem to scale, does seem to run well at scale, as they say. I think those would be the issues I'd be concerned about. With client-side Blazor, I'm not concerned at all. With server-side Blazor, I'm worried about the fact that I am putting another load on my server, and can I maintain all those connections? So, and server farms address both of those problems. Is there another question? What's the next question? Well, if there isn't another question, let me take the opportunity. I guess it was just that great a presentation. That's the only conclusion I can draw. Thank you very much for your time, your patience, your attention. Thanks for coming out for this. I hope you go back to work with the idea that yes, this is a new technology, but it is a production-ready and reliable technology, that if there is a JavaScript alternative, Blazor will do everything that your JavaScript alternative will do, and that it's certainly for intranet applications. There's no reason for you not to start using it right now. And I've got at least one coworker who's got a internet application built with Blazor, and he said, our stuff is so popular, our users are just living with the download time. I went, oh, well, you obviously got more forgiving users than I have. All right. Oh, so the question, how stable is Blazor? Gosh, that's another good question, and a difficult one for me to answer. In terms of the network connections, and let's remember, I've been building intranet applications. The answer to stable is vary. I mean, what I'm worried about there is network latency and maintaining that connection. And uh, we went to a lot of trouble to customize the experience of what happens when we lose that connection. I, I don't think any of our users have seen that yet. All as yet unused evidence. When I want to test the breaking the connection, I actually have to shut down the application on the server. I have to shut down the Blazor application on the server so we can see that this customized user interface actually does the right thing. But again, I'll refer you back to if you've ever used a chat window in a web application, it's exactly the same technology. So if you've been happy and comfortable with that, you're going to be happy and comfortable with Blazor. So, and really that's the only special point of stability that you need to worry about. If you're calling web services, of course, that works as well as web services do in any other application you would care to build. If you are accessing data sources from client-side Blazor, from server-side Blazor, that works as well as anything else you're doing. It's just indistinguishable. I mean, that's the beauty of having one toolkit. If it works in one environment, it's going to work in Blazor because it's the same toolkit. Oh, by the way, as long as I've got a couple minutes, there's one other thing I want to talk about. As long as I have you here, one of the things that comes with, and I know I said I was finishing up, but one of the other things that comes with .NET Core is something that Microsoft calls the .NET Standard. And the .NET Standard is the list of all of the resources, programming resources, objects, classes, application programming interfaces that are available on every platform that .NET Core runs on. So this is the stuff that is available on Android, iOS, Linux, Windows. I keep forgetting to mention Windows as one of the platforms this stuff runs on. And that's the .NET Standard Library. It's somewhere in the vicinity of 40 or 50,000 application programming interfaces. If you've done work with .NET Framework as a developer, it's everything that isn't Windows specific is in the .NET Standard. And that's what I use when I'm building with Blazor, is I use the .NET Standard interfaces. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm positioning myself to eventually roll this logic out with a different user interface into a Windows application, into a smartphone application, Android or iOS. So one of the, I think a good practice, I don't want to say a best practice, but I think a really good practice if you are building Blazor applications or really building any .NET Core application is to always be using the standard libraries. And that gives you that maximum portability. As I tried to suggest when I talked about the future, Blazor, I think, is all about portability. Oh, Cheryl, typing. Oh, well, I'm glad. I hope I addressed the questions that I think I would have had both as the head of an IT department and as a developer, and put you in a position to make good decisions about whether or not you should be working with Blazor going forward. So that was my goal. So hopefully I met your goals also. Oh, Andrew. Oh, can Blazor be used to build a PWA? Let me make sure. By PWA, you mean? You cannot tell the number of questions I've answered because I took the wrong three-letter acronym and ended up answering. Yeah, but that isn't what I want. What I asked about. Progressive web application. Yes, it can. Really, when we talk about progressive web application, a great deal of the time we are talking about how is the HTML presented. And Blazor running in your browser, it just works with the HTML. You can run into problems. Let's say that, for instance, in your web application, you want some of it to be available in some environment, some part of your user interface to be available in some part of your environment, and other parts of your user interface to not be available in that environment. And when you do that, you have to make sure that you write your code to recognize what environment you're in and take advantage of the parts that are present and ignore the parts that aren't present. Again, you have to do that with Blazor, but in terms of actually delivering the user interface, it's that's all HTML, and Blazor doesn't really care what, as I say, it's not deeply attached to its user interface. The other issue when we talk about progressive web applications is accessing the additional functionality that's available in the browser. And if you want to go, I hate to use the word old school with a technology that's only been in production for 4 months, but if you want to go old school on that, you would simply call out to your JavaScript code. And your JavaScript code, you'd write the same JavaScript code as you would write in a regular application, in a non-Blazor application to deal with that. The reason I buy PWA is my brain flashed personal web assistant because of another technology I work in. I went, oh, I bet that's not what Andrew means. The third issue, but the other thing, as I say, I'm finding more and more there are these libraries, both from Microsoft and from the community, because Blazor is open source, that are showing up that allow me to work with parts of the browser that may or may not be there, depending on the age of the browser and the functionality that's built into the browser. One of the things I notice is most of the libraries, and there's often several competing libraries, most of the libraries have an option for you to check to see whether or not it works on this browser, whether or not that functionality is actually available on this browser. And those are the libraries I'm taking, right? If I have a choice between two different ways of handling this, I will pick the library that automatically tells me whether or not it's available on this browser. And as a result, I can respond appropriately and write my code. So Blazor can be used to build a PWA. You have the same issues that you would have if you were doing it in JavaScript. And in fact, I would suggest the third-party libraries actually simplify part of the process. Granted, a rather small part of the process, but the important thing is they simplify part of the process. So, and aren't you glad I didn't give you the answer about personal web assistant? What's next? Well, it's 9:57. As usual, I talk too much. We're coming up on 10 o'clock, which is when we have to leave anyway. So once again, thank you for your time, your patience, your attention, and hopefully you went away with the necessary questions answered for you to think about when it would make sense for you or your organization to start using Blazor. Obviously, I have drunk the Kool-Aid. I think the answer to when should I start using Blazor is right now, but you get to have a different opinion if you'd like. Anyways, thanks for coming. Take care. Oh, Merry Christmas to you too. You're very welcome. Cheryl, my pleasure. John, Andrew, Ariel, and I'm just going to, I guess I better shut down the meeting. I've just got 2 minutes to get out. Thanks all.